Thank you for coming. Please don't go away just because of the noise. That's going to stop. This is the very last event in 5 years of Humanitas historiography programs, and I'm delighted that we're doing it here in the Natural History Museum, and with a fantastic lineup of panelists who are going to talk to us about the past and its publics. I just want to say a few thank yous briefly before I hand over to Professor MacMillan, who's going to chair the session tonight to explain how it's going to work. I want to thank first and foremost George Weidenfeld, who's no longer with us, for having the idea for the program, which I think has been amazingly successful, which I think he would have been pleased with. I need to thank Len and Emily Blavatnik and the Blavatnik Family Foundation for generously sponsoring the series and making it possible financially. I want to thank Victoria McGuinness, Hannah Penny, Sarah Bebb, and all the people at Torch who provided logistical support and administrative assistance in making the events work. Natalia Garkova and her colleagues at the Weidenfeld-Hoffmann Trust, formerly the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, in providing all the support for me in running the events. And most of all, finally, I'd like to thank Simon Schama for coming to us from an extraordinarily hectic schedule of planning an extraordinarily ambitious series of films that he's engaged in at the moment, and for making such a lot of time to not only to give us a lecture on Monday, to participate in the roundtable this evening, but also to meet with graduate students and undergraduates, to exchange emails with people, to be invited to breakfast at random by our second years, and do all kinds of other things. It's been really wonderful having him here, and I really want to say thank you very much, Simon, for making the time to be with us. This evening is intended as much a conversation as possible, a conversation obviously between the three people at the front, but also involving as many of you as possible. That the idea of talking about public history is to engage the public, not just to talk ourselves. So there'll be relatively brief presentations from each of our panelists, a general discussion among them, but also, as far as possible, an open question and answer session and discussion with the audience, at which you should feel free, please, to raise any questions that you want to raise. Do obviously keep the debate civil and polite, but it would be great to have a really wide-ranging and engaging discussion to close what's been a really engaging and wide-ranging series. I just want to finally introduce Margaret MacMillan before she introduces everybody else. Professor Margaret MacMillan is, as probably you all know, an extremely distinguished international historian, author of a landmark book on the 1919 Versailles settlement, Peacemakers, but also of books on the use and abuse of history and on history's people, so very much issues that we're addressing tonight. And she's the warden of St Anthony's College. She's going to be chairing the panel, and I'm going to turn over to her now. Thank you very much, Margaret, and thank you for coming.
Well, James, thank you so much for organizing this and getting us all here and sending all those emails. I'm in the very fortunate position of both being a panelist and the chair, which means I'm going to give myself a huge amount of time and cut the rest of them off very briefly. But no, what I'd like to do, what we thought we'd do is we'd each talk for about 10 minutes about history, history's publics, how we see the role of history, the engagement between historians and the publics, and then perhaps briefly respond to each other and then throw it open to you. And what I'd like to do before we start is just very briefly, and I could do it at great length because they're both very distinguished, but very briefly introduce my two co-panelists. I think we're very lucky to have with us two historians who have such a wide range of interests, combined with very deep expertise in particular fields. They are also people who speak to the publics, who talk to the publics, who curate art shows for the publics, who have been engaged as historians and public intellectuals in, I think, explaining history, trying to make history that means something to people. And so we're very, I think, lucky to have them with us tonight, reflecting about the relationship between history and publics. Craig Clunas is going to speak, sorry, I'm doing it in the reverse order. Craig Clunas is going to speak second, but I've done it alphabetically here. As you probably know, he's an art historian who's also a curator. He's an expert on Chinese art history and culture. Has also done studies in the methodology and historiography. His most recent book is Screen of Kings, Art and Royal Power in Ming China. Simon Schama, who's going to speak first, is an historian who is an expert, first I think in the golden age of Dutch history, in the French Revolution, moved in very interesting ways into art history, has also used television as a medium to try and make history relevant to people. He writes newspaper columns. I think what he doesn't do probably is sleep. His most recent book is The Face of Britain, which is also a television series. So, Simon, if I may ask you to start, and then Craig second. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margaret. Yeah, I just want to return to the a deep gesture of gratitude to Trinity College, to James, to the Humanitas program, and to the shade of George Weidenfeld, who's hovering over all of us, really. The vision of a hovering George is slightly scary, really, actually. But we should be scared, very scared of this whole subject. I'm certainly scared of my co-panelists, that goes without saying. I've been thinking about Benedetto Croce and the truism, axiom, epigram, which we grew up with, really, as kids. All history is contemporary history. And in a way, it's a sort of cry of self-discovery and a cry of despair that Croce, I'm sure you know, was notorious for flirting with fascism, certainly having a kind of dreamlike sympathies, really, of the way in which Italy might be resurrected in the 20th century, and not as, by his later standards, having been sufficiently alert to the brutality of the fascist regime, and to which then he had a kind of Pauline conversion in the right direction, and became a sort of practicing civic historian in a way which made it inescapable that he would be a dissenter, a rejectionist, a member of the intellectual resistance, and of course suffered for it. On Monday, at the end of my lecture, I mentioned other examples of historians, engagé historians, during the war, particularly on Heisinger, who really kind of lost his life when his department turned his back on him. Some of us have felt that way sometimes, but it hasn't literally happened. I don't mean literally, they betrayed him to the Gestapo, but they might as well have done. He was deserted by his faculty at Leiden. He was under a kind of house arrest, and then not so much of a house arrest, and eventually died. More famously and more terminally, Marc Bloch. And I said a word, forgive me if those of you who are here on Monday, if I just repeat this story, because I grew up with loving Marc Bloch's work, and he was someone, if you know Strange Defeat, of course, actually, who never made any separation between his public political life and his historical research, even though, of course, he is famously, rightly known for his work on feudal society. It would make both a wonderful and a terrible play, I think, his relationship with Lucien Febvre, with whom he founded the Annales, Économie, Société, Civilisation. And the story of what happened between them has made me think and feel differently about the Annales, which was mother's milk to me when I was discovering social history and anthropological history, a bit in a way Monsieur Jourdain discovers he's been speaking prose. In the 1960s, because Febvre, also intrinsically and intellectually a great historian, they were both faced with pressure from the Vichy authorities to drop Bloch, being a Jew, from the masthead. And Febvre began with a slightly timorous reluctance to do that. But when it was put to him that really the operation of the Annales would have to close down, he went to Bloch, in effect, and said, well, the survival of the Annales is the most important thing, isn't it? And a friend of Bloch said, it's actually not the most important thing. And Bloch really moved himself out of the way. He was dropped. It wouldn't have made any difference. He hadn't moved himself out of the way, wrote passionately and agonizingly about it, joined the resistance, and was shot in 1944. So with those kinds of ghosts lying upon one, it's weird, really, to think when I was an undergraduate in the 1960s, the notion of an engaged historian was thought to be vulgar, was thought to be intellectually deforming. It was called presentism. And the ghost that was being laid in that case was, of course, Thomas Babington Macaulay, because the equation was made that actually the engaged historian was essentially embarked on an exercise of self-congratulation. Essentially, if you were Macaulay, everything was leading inexorably on the speeding locomotive of progress, and the essential objective was to discover the genealogy of the wonderfulness of how we now are. That's actually not true of Macaulay, as a matter of fact. A more excruciatingly tormented figure it's hard to imagine among Victorian greats, but you could easily read the history of England and suppose that to be true. Hence that terrible phrase, weak history, dissected, analysed in a rather shallow way, I think, by Herbert Butterfield, who wasn't a shallow historian. And so this was a no-no. This was such a no-no. What you had to do was disabuse yourself of any sense of being in the slipstream of contemporary self-congratulation. It's what the Soviets did. It's what the more egregiously naive Americans did. And instead, what was to be upheld, and I'm saying this a bit too sardonically, but what was to be upheld was the sovereignty of difference. It was really the past as a foreign country. And there was something absolutely true about that. You don't really so want to compress the distance between now and then as to be projecting backwards one's own preoccupations. This is something which is part of the success of Wolf Hall. I love, but when Hilary Mantel ingeniously invents that language for Thomas Cromwell on the first page, it's a language which you could possibly hear in an East End pub now. And part of the success of doing that is in some sense to make our identification with what happened then unavoidable. And it's something very wise that Butterfield said, or was it Trevelyan? Help, I think it may have been Trevelyan actually, Macaulay's heir apparent, that all history is a negotiation between remoteness and familiarity, that the poetry of history, I think this was Butterfield, the poetry of history lies in the recognition that those who are its subjects are simultaneously just like us and irretrievably not like us, and that's true. But, and I'm coming on to part two, and swiftly. But, there's Thucydides, ain't there? Thucydides is our founding father, even if Herodotus gets the title, and I devoted a lot more time to the latter than the former on Monday. And Thucydides was a protagonist. He was a general fired for military failure and exiled. The point of Thucydides, it strikes me, and again, I'm being mawkishly sententious now, it strikes me that the honour of the historical profession, as he founded it, was to be a gadfly, was to keep people awake at night, was to be a thorn in the side of self-congratulation and complacency. That whole book is actually modelled narratively around a catastrophe, around the expedition to Syracuse, not around Pericles' funeral oration. And actually very interesting when Pericles' speech is taken out of context and translated into core curriculum, as it always is in America, it looks like an apology for contemporary American democracy. But the whole structure of the book is profoundly tragic wherever you look. Profoundly tragic in ways in which Thucydides surely wished to echo. He said he wanted, as I said on Monday, his book to be a possession to last forever, and he was thinking about himself using sources more critically than he attributed to Herodotus. But the point was that, and those issues, everybody, what happens to a city when it's struck by a pandemic? How many people do you have to kill to be safe in the opposition? And what is the nature of imperial overreach? All those issues surely are with us today. And so I think actually in a sense in which, of course you can be an honourable and brilliant and successful historian by taking the anti-presentist view, by being obsessed with the abuses of the past and feeling that historians, when they are engagés, will be defiled by touching the pitch of polemic. And there again, there is Ken Livingstone. I won't even finish the sentence. There is Donald Trump. Donald Trump, I will finish that sentence. The incident I'm thinking about was where one of Donald Trump's shticks early on in the campaign, where he claimed, and it is mostly an apocryphal story, that General Pershing ordered bullets to be dipped in pig's blood, and for it to be known to Filipino Muslim rebels, so when they were shot, they'd be permanently defiled. And there's an argument about whether that ever happened or whether Pershing said that, and that's an argument about the sources. What is not an argument is that Donald Trump said that did it. That was the end of the rebellion in the Philippines. no, it wasn't. This was one of the wars that America did not win, that it actually wore down relentlessly. It absolutely even if it did happen, which is in doubt, it didn't do that. So, wherever you look now, the Holocaust denial. This morning on my Twitter feed, and I'll finish there, I think it said, when will Israel apologize for 9/11? Yeah. So there are jobs, what I'm saying is right now, there are jobs for historians to do. And I'll just add a last sentence. And that is that I don't know if Craig and Margaret agree with me. I think Margaret is presumptuous, is going to agree with me. But it's been a surprise to historians, the return of atavism, the intensely visceral return of national mythologies. If you look at some of the wilder shores of Brexiteering, or whether you look at what's happening in Central Europe and so on, it is an incredible surprise that the Freedom Party is about to produce a Chancellor of Austria. This has been a huge surprise, and it was not sort of one on the cards of the world in the 1950s and 60s and where I grew up. And this is something where if historians recuse themselves from intervening in the puncturing of dangerous mythologies about tribal allegiance, then we are possibly being a little dishonourable, and if not dishonourable, cowards.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Craig.
Thank you. I'm going to avail myself of the crutch of some images, because I'm going to talk about China, and I'm going to talk about some material that I don't think is going to be very familiar to people. It may be familiar to some people in this room. So one of the ways in China in which the history reaches a large public is through the very popular television serials that deal with episodes of China's past. And one that was broadcast in 2009, which happened to be when I was in China on a research trip, was Zheng He Xia Xi Yang. Zheng He Sails the Western Seas. This was on television more or less every night, 59 episodes. They were 2 hours each. This was a colossal production. It's a big country. They do things on a very, very big scale. And the context of this, or rather what this television series is about, is the series of imperially commissioned voyages in the early 15th century into the Indian Ocean, through which the new Ming state in China sort of encouraged and intimidated states of the Indian Ocean to enter into the kinds of diplomatic relations with it that are sometimes called the tribute system. So, this was lavishly done, wonderful kind of spectacle. The actor who played the Yongle Emperor, Tang Guoqiang, who's a big star of Chinese television, has played a number of kind of important historical roles in the past. He's played the great war sort of magician Zhuge Liang. He's played a great 17th century emperor, and he's also famous for playing Mao Zedong in historical dramas set in the 20th century. So, and here he is doing that kind of almost a sort of nostalgic throwback to the 1960s. He's gazing into the future, and he's gazing into the future of China's oceanic greatness. And the theme song of this series makes it absolutely clear what he's doing. China's oceanic greatness takes all kinds of forms, including kind of the discovery of exotic and primitivist maidens on islands in the South Seas. So, this thing goes along. So, it's quite easy to, before we start mocking that kind of public history, we might think about the Borgias and the Tudors and the ways in which those sort of things come to us now. And of course, to pick up on something Simon just said, this is absolutely to do with self-congratulation. This is I've often thought that 1066 and all that, one of my very favorite kind of pieces of public history that I still turn to all the time, it starts by saying, this history exists to console the reader. No other history does this. Actually, it seems to me almost all history exists to console the reader in one way or another, or lots of the not-so-good history exists to console the reader. And the self-congratulatory stuff about, you know, China's greatness in the early 15th century and how warmly welcomed it was by all these exotic kind of peoples of the Indian Ocean. It's not hard to, and many commentators have already, you know, you can relate this kind of thing to, you know, China now being Africa's largest trading partner, the kind of, this historic episode plays a very important part in contemporary Chinese discourses of, you know, China's past relations with this part of the world and what they can be like again. So what I was doing in China in 2009 was doing the preparatory work for a book, which Margaret referred to, but the ideas of which then, through discussion with colleagues in the British Museum, turned into an exhibition called Ming, 50 Years That Changed China, that was held at the British Museum from 14 to 15. Now, I began my career, as Margaret intimated, as a museum curator. I worked in the Victoria and Albert Museum, but I'd never really been right at the beating heart. I'd been quite junior. I'd never been really at the beating heart of a very big exhibition. And also I suspect museums have changed a lot in these days. And I would say the experience of doing a big exhibition is a bit like being a script writer whose idea is picked up by a big studio. That is, you go, hooray, because my work is going to reach a very large audience, and 125,000 people saw this exhibition, which is a massively larger number than those who would have ever read any of my kind of specialist writing. But on the other hand, you're not in control of all kinds of things. So, for example, the exhibition, the title Ming, 50 Years That Changed China was not chosen by myself or my co-curator. I suspect what the British Museum would really have liked is 50 years that made China what it is today. That kind of presentism that was referred to earlier. And of course, as you'll see from the logo here, you find yourself public history often costs money, or it involves large-scale resources, whether it's television series or large exhibitions. The British Museum's exhibition program sponsored by BP, and I don't need to tell people in this room how kind of completely problematic that was for many people. Immediately, almost as if we had kind of lined him up, about 3 weeks after the exhibition opened, Xi Jinping said, "Several thousand years ago, the Chinese nation trod a path that was different from other nations' culture and development. It is not a coincidence that we started up socialism with Chinese characteristics. It was decided by our country's historical inheritance and cultural traditions. History is created by the people, and so is civilization. We should be more respectful and mindful of 5,000 years of continuous Chinese culture." So the sense is that any presentation, I mean, this is the issue that I felt, you know, how does one present this to an audience in a way that has kind of integrity, but that cannot not be being done in a larger context. You cannot pretend that this larger context simply doesn't exist. Particularly as one of the things we very much wanted to do in this exhibition was stress not just the kinds of things that people might imagine they were going to see in an exhibition of Ming art, but also those kind of things which draw attention to the connectedness, the very particular kinds of connectedness in China in this early part of the 15th century. So the Chinese porcelain that is modelled after Islamic metalwork shapes, or this Quran, the earliest dated Chinese Quran, written in Beijing in 1401 by a member of its large Muslim community. So in a way, what we're doing by that is trying to complicate Xi Jinping's kind of China's specialness and difference and so on by talking about its relationship to other things. One of the objects in the exhibition, which I was sort of most excited to get, was this gold ingot dated 1419, which was very recently excavated. It was excavated at the beginning of this century from a tomb in Hubei province, a tomb of a minor aristocrat, collateral member of the imperial family. And it has this inscription on it which says that it was bought in the Western Ocean. That is, it claims to be the gold of the Western Ocean being the Chinese name for what we call the Indian Ocean. And this is in fact the only surviving object which can be identified as claiming, whether it's true or not, claiming that it comes from this particular series of expeditions. I mean, I happen to believe this is absolutely genuine, but I have heard a very distinguished historian who I won't name say, you know, this fits so well with contemporary Chinese agendas about what they want to say about the peaceful and trade-based nature of their relationship with the Indian Ocean in the 15th century, that it's been faked up. I don't personally believe that, and I could go into arguments as to why not. But that and the bell at Zhenghe, this is one of the kind of star items right in the center of the new National Museum of Chinese History in the center of Beijing. Happy to lend those kind of things because, you know, although they make a point we want to make, that China was not isolated, was connected to the rest of the world, there's equally the problematic thing that you can't pretend that you're not also, that the thing will be read in certain ways that you don't completely control. Now I want to be a bit more optimistic about the past and its publics in China and talk just a tiny bit, now I hope this isn't too technical, about the nature, about the Chinese language and the language as a resource. This is the cover of the English edition of the biography of Jim Morrison, frontman of the Doors, a notorious wild man who kind of lived fast, died young, and left a good-looking corpse. The biography had been published under the title "No One Here Gets Out Alive." This Chinese, Zhou Limeran Chu Ji Huo, is what you get if you put that phrase, "No one here gets out alive," into Google Translate. And actually, it's perfect. It is Chinese. It's not. This is not a crack at Google Translate. It's a perfectly kind of accurate translation, word for word, of the statement. But that's not what the Chinese edition is actually called. The Chinese edition is called 此地无人生还. That is written in classical Chinese, a form of Chinese that was the written form of the language hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago, but which still exists very much in the present. For example, it is the kind of language in which the dialogue of historical series like that are used. And it's very recently, particularly in internet culture in China, become a resource for what you might call sarcasm about the powers that be. It's being used in China by people on the internet, almost as if people, if people were to say, you know, "Prithee, sirrah, I doubt that be the case." You know, it's that kind of use of the past by a public which completely sort of circumvents some of the official historical narratives, and which gives me, in particular, or gives me, you know, a certain amount of optimism that, try as one might to kind of impose a particular reading of the past, and China, goodness knows, is one of the places where the state puts a huge amount of resource into that. People find ways of coming at the past which don't absolutely have to swallow those stories. And that I find a source of comfort in this, as Simon Schama said, extremely dangerous and in some ways troubling world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you both very much. And I'm just going to say something. You've both covered so much, and I think raised so many questions. I just want to say something about where I see the dangers in history could lie, and also a bit more about how I see the role of historians. There used to be a joke in the Soviet Union. There were many jokes because it was a way of trying to deal with that dreadful regime. There used to be a joke that it's not the future that's the problem, understanding the future, it's the past that keeps changing. And it did keep changing. I mean, the Soviet government was very well aware, as other totalitarian governments are, of the power of history, because how history does, among other things, is raise the possibility of alternatives. that there were other roads, there were other sorts of societies, there were other ways of organizing yourselves, that they didn't have to be in a particular shape. And I think some of you know the famous story of the photo that was taken very early on in the Russian Revolution of the Bolsheviks. And Lenin was their key figure, he'd really the central figure in the revolution. On one side, one end, a rather small and insignificant Stalin, who was indeed insignificant in making the revolution of 1917, and then a lot of other Bolsheviks. Once Stalin got in power and these people began to disappear, the photo kept changing. And it was cropped. In those days, it didn't have Photoshop, so it wasn't always cropped very well. You could sometimes, if you look carefully, I think, see where things had been patched up. And in the end, what was left pretty much, because everyone else was dead or sent to the Gulag, was Lenin with Stalin apparently standing over him and telling him what to do. And it's a very good example, I think, of the ways in which governments can use and manipulate history. But there is some truth in the Russian joke, and that is that the past does keep changing. Not because necessarily governments are trying to change it, but because we find out other things, and because we keep shifting our perspective on the past and keep changing the sorts of questions we want to ask. New evidence comes up. People find locked trunks. People find sources of documents, as they did recently, for example, the Foreign Office documents, which had a lot to say about the British reaction to the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya. Documents do turn up. New types of evidence turn up. Or we look at evidence in different ways. I read a very interesting article the other day on women in the Byzantine period. And there's not that much evidence about women because, for the most part, people didn't think it was worth writing about women. And what this author did is look at what preachers said about women. And he came up with this wonderful idea, and I think it made sense, that there are so many complaints from clerics in the Byzantine Empire about women going to the baths and going to circuses too much that they were probably doing an awful lot of it. And so you can take evidence and try and tease out different types of interpretations. But we also ask different sorts of questions, and I think Simon has talked about this very well. I mean, we ask questions, and Craig too, we ask questions that preoccupy us. And so women's history, for example, was not really a proper subject when I went to university in the 1960s. If you picked up an average textbook and looked at the index, you'd see lots about constitutions, you'd see lots about changes in the economy, you'd see lots about wars, about treaties, but if you looked up the category woman, there wouldn't be much there. And I think it was really with the rise of a women's movement in the 1970s that women's history became a subject. Women began, and others, not just women, but men too, began to want to ask what had it been like for women in the past. Today, we're looking increasingly at environmental history, and I think there are very good reasons why we're looking at this. And so the sorts of questions we ask keep changing. Nevertheless, I think history can be a dangerous subject, and I think Simon referred to this, the reappearance of what seems to me a terribly 19th century sort of history, these national histories, which give a very limited history. They posit that something called the nation was there in the past, like a sort of solid object, that there was something called the Serb nation, or the Croat nation, or the Chinese nation, and it somehow persisted through time, and all you have to do is uncover the story, that this has always existed. And such stories are often told either in terms of great humiliation, which serve as a sort of rallying point. You think of the Serbian nationalist history, which so focused, and it didn't always do this, but by the 19th century was so focusing on the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, the great defeat of the Serbian people, which became a central part, at least for Serbian nationalist historians, of the injustices and the miseries that the Serbian nation had suffered, but also a story of redemption, because the legend at the Battle of Kosovo is that Prince Lazar, the night before the battle, had a vision, was visited by a holy vision, and was told that he had a choice. He could either die on the battlefield the next day, but if he chose to die, his people would be resurrected one day. And this became a very powerful part, not for all Serbs, but a very powerful part of a Serbian nationalist history, a promise of redemption and resurrection. What also became a very powerful part of Serbian nationalist history was that Prince Lazar, like the Serbs were going to do for centuries afterwards, was fighting as a Christian against the Muslims. That this was a clash, as Huntington would have it, of civilization. In fact, the story is much more complicated than that. There were Serb Christians fighting with the Ottomans. One of Prince Lazar's own sons went on to become an Ottoman general. But this was not the story that got told in the nationalist histories, and I think we still see these sorts of nationalist history todays, and they seem to be coming back. I'm very concerned when you get governments, for example, in Hungary or in Poland, talking about European Christian values, about how we have a tradition, about how that tradition must be maintained. It gives a very limited view of what their histories are. But it's not dangerous just because it's a distortion of the past. I think it's also very dangerous because that sort of history is used to mobilize people in the present. It's used to inculcate a sense of perhaps grievance, a sense of redemption, a sense that things are going to get better. You see the same thing with the sorts of history that Islamist jihadists tell, that ISIS, or Daesh, if you want to call it that, tell, that once there was this golden age for Muslims when they all lived in harmony before the divisions between Shia and Sunni emerged, and that golden age will come again, that it can be used, this story is used to project into the future and to mobilize people in the future. I think you see a sort of history like this being, and as you've referred to, in China. Since the 1990s, there's been a patriotic education campaign in China, which has tried to promote, and you get this, it's not just in China, but the Chinese example is I think, an interesting one, tries to promote a particular view of Chinese history. More recently, the president has been going around saying the schools, the universities must promote a particular view of Chinese history, must make the Chinese proud to be Chinese, must point out how much they have suffered at the hands of outsiders. And this, I think, is dangerous. I think it's always dangerous when governments get involved in writing history because they tend to write it with a great big blunt pickaxe. I mean, I thought Michael Gove's views that there should be a kind of patriotic history of the First World War was not something he properly should have. I mean, he's perfectly entitled to have his views, but not something that should become, anyway, government policy. And so I think what historians should do, and I think we should be engaged, I think this is very, very important, the idea that we should not defile ourselves, as Simon put it, by touching the pitch of public opinion is wrong, because if we don't do it, someone else is going to, and that someone else is not going to necessarily do it very well. I think we have to take part in debates. We have to act to puncture some of the myths that are out there. I mean, I think we're often, you called us gadflies. I sometimes see us like those people you all dread at dinner parties, who someone's telling a very funny story, and he said, I caught the bus on a Tuesday.
Does that.
Yes, and someone says, yes, I'm sorry, that bus doesn't run on a Tuesday. You're that sort of person, which is infuriating, and it ruins the story, and it doesn't matter. But I think what we say does matter. I think we do have an obligation to get involved in public debates. And I think, very interesting at the moment, historians are getting involved in the debate in Britain about the referendum on both sides, and that's absolutely as it should be. Historians, like anyone else, are entitled to their views. But where I think historians need to get involved in a constructive way is, again, to puncture perhaps some of the myths. And speaking as a Canadian, I'm increasingly worried about the way in which Canada is being portrayed in the debate over the referendum as a sort of mythological country, usually by people, if I may say so, who know nothing about Canada, but they hold it up as an example of what Britain could be or might be, often getting Canadian history wrong. And I do think, as I say, we need to be engaged, but I do think we have to be sure that we get engaged in constructive ways. I don't think we should try and push the public debate necessarily in a particular way, but I think we have an obligation to say when we think the public debate is going wrong, and to say when we think those who are using history are going wrong. And so I think we will continue, to be like those irritating people at dinner parties. I'm sorry about that, but I do think it's the role that we have to play, and I think we ought to. As I say, if we don't do it, someone else will. So perhaps I've talked enough. Perhaps I'd like to ask you both if you would like to sort of contribute, come in now and comment on what either of you have said, and then we'll throw it open to you. So Simon, anything?
Well, I'm so grateful to both your comments. I especially love Craig's revelation, really. The extraordinary, the classical Chinese. You then, was the potential instrument of sly sedition, really. It'd be more like, you use sort of cod Shakespeare, but it'd be more like using Latin or something, really. It's a kind of, it's just wonderful. But I did want to sort of take that point further. It seems, we've got, alas, we're all kind of on the same page. That's a downer, isn't it? But for a start. So we're not arguing very fiercely with each other. But I did want to raise this issue of form. We can indeed be the person who says, and we do, that bus doesn't run on Tuesdays. The issue is actually that rationalism, cosmopolitanism, Olympian empiricism, all the things we love and practice, are so profoundly unsexy in the contemporary world. You wish they were. It is a question, I'm being facetious there using that word, that the sense, what Donald Trump has going for him as someone who lives in America, or probably Marine Le Pen, or I can't remember his name actually, the successor to Jörg Haider in Austria, what they all have going is the kind of, like what West Ham did to the Manchester United bus yesterday. I had this kind of visceral, fierce, violent sleaziness, which sort of sets the insides boiling both with rage and pride. The point about the kind of spurious Pershing story I told, one of many, that Donald Trump, is that it seems to be that degree of, that degree of violent self-congratulation seems to be an elixir for complication. Much of the world does not want to do homework, unlike everybody in this room, in this university. It wants a kind of enchanted route to everything getting better overnight. And it is a kind of poison charisma that's at work here. And we are really poorly equipped. Do my columns in the FT going to make a difference? Almost certainly not. I will go on writing them. I love Linda Colley's, art column about imperial nostalgia. And maybe it's not for us, but we need to kind of discover a form, actually, where we can change minds at the kind of enraged mob level. I don't quite know what it is.
Okay, Craig.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, the return of atavism, absolutely. And I was wondering while you were saying it, kind of what you thought about, we all know whose fault it is primarily, but what part you feel that professional historians play. You kind of implied that by not getting engaged, that opens the space. But if one descends to that level of enragement, I mean, you're going to continue to write in the Financial Times. Maybe should we be doing, do you have ideas? Should we be doing something else? Should we be writing more stuff for the television? Or, more drama for the television?
Yeah,
it's drama.
Yeah.
It's drama that
the
is
Twitter sphere is a horrible place, but it's not good to keep out of it. You get trolled. When I did a debate in Toronto on television,
I'm so sorry.
No. I was very glad to do it. I was debating, talk about someone who the word Christian appears every 2 minutes on his lips. That's Nigel Farage who was there. And I gave us a slightly more hospitable view of policy towards refugees. And I got weeks of hardcore neo-Nazi trolling. My head in a gas album. You have to deal with that.
But
it's not a nice place to be. But the consequences of, and it's not for everybody really. I realise that.
But I suppose one of the big changes, it seems to me, is that trolling, those neo-Nazis could have been, and probably were, anywhere and everywhere. They're coming at you from all, so that it isn't localized in the way. That's kind of what I was implying about, where is the history of the Zheng He voyages? Is it in the British Museum? Is it in the Chinese thing? And I was struck, this very morning I got an email inviting me to sign, other people in the room may have got it, inviting me to, as a historian, would you like to sign a petition kind of opposing simplistic readings and that are being used by people in favor of Brexit. And I paused over this because it said, as a historian of Britain and Europe, you have been, and I thought, well, I'm not a historian of Britain and Europe. I've never written anything about the history of Britain. I've never written anything about the history of Europe. Am I allowed to have a view? I mean, I'm British, but am I allowed to, am I allowed to have, so that in some ways that kind of, the sense that their history is their history and our history is our history, and maybe that what we need to be doing is, as historians, is taking responsibility for history as a kind of almost now as a global phenomenon. I mean,
I think that's true.
it doesn't, because we can't now say, well, it's horrible what's happening in Hungary, but I'm not a historian of Hungary, so I have no locus standi.
But I think what we know about is evidence, and I think we can have views. We can say, look, let's question some of this. I mean, I do think I wouldn't take a view on Ming China unless someone said to me, do you think there's anything, in the story that the Ming colonized Africa? And I'd say, well, there's no evidence for that. I do think we can do that. But I think we need to, I'm with Simon, I don't want to be attacked by trolls, but I think we need to get out there, and I think we need to debate. And this attitude, which you still get in the history profession, is that what we're doing is so arcane and so complicated, we will not condescend to try and explain it to someone. I once had an argument with not even a colleague, someone in a Canadian university who wrote to me and said, your view that we should get involved, he said, is ridiculous. He said, I see myself as a scientist, and what I'm doing is so arcane and complicated, I can't explain it to ordinary people. And he said, also, I'm so busy doing research, I don't have time to write clearly. So, wasn't it wonderful? I said, may I quote you on that?
Get tenure?
Yes. Oh, he already had tenure, and he was very. I met a student who'd been in his master's classes, and she said he was great on the theory, but never actually read anything about what was actually happening. But I think there is that attitude. I mean, I think television is a good medium. I think radio is a good medium. I think writing in ways that are accessible are important. Advising, or if we get listened to, advising on historical movies. I mean, it is so irritating to see historical movies where they get it completely wrong. I don't know how many people saw that. There was a wonderful, and they wouldn't have listened to us, but there was a wonderful, not so wonderful, Robin Hood with Kevin Costner.
Oh, yeah.
Which had a feminist Maid Marian. Well, it just doesn't work, and he was a deeply caring, sensitive man in touch with his inner feelings. I'm not sure.
On that, I want to kind of vent just for a moment, actually, about War and Peace, which, was a good thing to happen. War and Peace, the TV. But I was actually thunderstruck that I think if you dared to take Count Leo Tolstoy aside and ask him, what's the single most important page? And which page is your heart's blood stained the writing? He would say the moment where Pierre goes to André on the Battle of Borodino as a kind of, a curious viewer of what is about to unfold. And André does not want him there. And he treats him to a lesson against the romance of war, saying war is murder, it's killing, we kill as many as we can of them without a twitch of remorse, and they're the same to us. It's profoundly, Tolstoy of course had been in war himself, profoundly modern, and it's so deeply the essence of War and Peace. The love bit, of course, of Pierre and Natasha is the opposite. And they cut it. I was absolutely thunderstruck. It's not even very long, and it is actually deeply dramatic moments, isn't it, actually, because Pierre is, he's never quite the same again after that, actually.
I think you'll have to become an internet troll and tell them how much you hate them. Do you want one last word and then we'll throw it open?
No, I'm happy to.
Okay, and I don't know if there's anyone with a microphone or you're just going to have to shout. Okay, the gentleman right there. Yep.
Do you panelists think that one of the main reasons that we haven't, that some historians refuse or are reluctant to get involved in cultivation, is that we fundamentally don't like being wrong? And this is impeding, in my view, what we really should be seeing is great. The modern trend is towards internet personalities and internet shows. And so why can't we have a great internet history so we're not reduced to sniping the sidelines or trying to, or trawling those that have got it wrong in the first place, actually shaping out and engaging in the most popular meeting that we have.
So you're not suggesting we sort of have something like The Apprentice where we all battle with each other and then get thrown out? No. Okay. Craig, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can think of examples of historians in the public sphere who have, and I'm honored to be sharing a platform with one of them, who kind of, by just sticking to their guns and maintaining their integrity as historians, have gotten themselves a hearing. I mean, I think I would feel that Mary Beard was another one of, was another example of that kind of thing. And goodness knows what, she's had to put up with a lot as well, in terms of abuse and trolling and all of that kind of horrible stuff. But there is some evidence that kind of just keeping on with integrity will in some cases, maybe not in all cases, but will in some cases have results. Have some of us, kind of, I don't like the phrase dumbing down, but I mean, maybe it's more like frivolousing up, rather than, it's gotten a bit frothy sometimes. And there is homework to be done as well, and we're not living in a culture that kind of favors the doing of homework, in all kinds of areas. I mean, I think if you had 3 scientists sitting here talking about the public engagement of science and how much the public understands about, basic concepts like risk and so on, they would be saying kind of some of the same sort of things about, we need to get out there, but then we can think of positive role models and positive examples there too.
Can I ask you a bit where are you? Hi. When you said internet narrative, did you mean internet, organising internet debates? Or I wasn't quite clear how you saw it happening. But
the idea would be internet debates or sort of series that are broadcast on the internet.
Customised for.
Yeah.
I think that's very good. I think that's terrific.
Yeah.
I will see you after class.
Okay.
I would say that a guy called Mark, Hartford, I think, did an ingenious thing. He did a docudrama, but it was a very good one, and very, very, it was entirely of the truth and of the documents about the last days of Robespierre and the terror. And it was followed, I think it was actually after the Wannsee conference programme, and it was followed by, Susanna Lipscomb's up there, you were in the Anne Boleyn one, right, Susie? Yeah. And what the genius was that he actually, it was rather brilliantly shot. It was, his whole sense is there's a lot of history happens. Oh, the one on decision, Britain's decision to go First World War was another one.
Yeah,
it was shot entirely in a committee room, and that was indeed the case at the Committee of Public Safety. And he had many people, Hilary Mantel, who wrote a rather extraordinary book on Saint-Just, but he had me and Slavoj Žižek, and we were not in the same room together. And we were, at it. We could not have been more ferociously opposed. Did you see this? And it was so cunningly edited. It was as though we were kind of Danton Robespierre or something like that. We were arguing. It was as though we'd become sort of protagonists in the French Revolution drama. But what we had to say was, it may well be you can never have a revolution without breaking eggs, but does it have to be the biggest bloody omelette in the world or something? So we were at odds, and it was very ingeniously done, and that could be, what you are asking for, I think, is going to happen. Actually, it needs a kind of rather brilliant organising, producing.
There you are. New career.
Yeah, new career for you, I think.
Okay, I think what I'm going to do, I have 2 questions. Maybe I'll take them both. So the gentleman here and then the woman a row behind. Yes.
I've been listening to this debate with growing interest and agreement, and I find myself nodding off, but also with increasing unease. The reason I say that is because I'm married to a teacher of history in a secondary school, and was trying to reconcile this view about selection of facts and presentation of information to provide a view in a way which can be palatable in the sort of simplistic way that unfortunately one has to teach history in schools. My wife had to deal with teaching Roman Britain, Tudors and Stuarts, and Nazi Germany.
So what's your question?
You should repeat the question.
I will.
Here is how does she manage to reconcile the demands of a curriculum that looks for a simple and easy solution to provide information to children with the complications and complexity of quote the truth and the different interpretations.
Okay, thanks. Yep, thank you. I think I've got it. I don't know, you probably couldn't all hear it, but how do you I think especially teaching younger children, how do you reconcile what is often a complicated story of the past with the need to make it comprehensible to them and simple to them? I would quibble a bit with your idea that there's something called the truth in the past. I mean, there are different...
He was doing the finger thing.
Yeah, finger thing. Okay, thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you. So let me just, if I may, I hope I got your question right, and perhaps the lady there, and then we'll ask panel to deal with both questions. Yeah.
Well, in fact, it's quite handy because I'm a teacher, and my question is, you are asking, where should you go with this? How should you get to the equivalent of the West Ham plans? Well, I work in the area of the West Ham plans, and these national mythologies are being created, and they're being very, very easily taken up by our young minds. They have thousands of celebrity shows and thousands of television dramas to watch. What they really need are well-educated, sensible, articulate people like you, who are real, who come into their school and who don't make it trivial, who don't make it dumbed down, and who don't make it too simple.
So your question
They
is...
are intelligent young people.
Yeah. So the question is how we get that to happen.
And how can we please
Yeah.
bring you into the real world
Yeah.
with real children
Yeah.
so they
Yeah.
can dispel these myths for themselves?
Yeah, thank you. So I think both questions about how we teach history to the young. And if I can just start usurping my position as chair, I mean, I think one of the things that's terribly important is to get children interested, and I think that means stories, but also to get it into the conversation early on that it's all right to have different opinions about the past, that there is not a single version of the past, that in fact looking at the past, engaging with the past, is a constant process of questioning. You've got to get the facts straight. You've got to know what happened when. But the idea that it's an open-ended story, I think, is a very important one. So, Simon, would you like to weigh in on
Well,
this?
no, I'm moved with both the small and the big end by both your remarks, and it is very important. I actually do go into schools in New York, actually, a bit. The curriculum is in flux yet again, isn't it, really? Yeah. I mean, Michael Gove, who had an extremely, crudely narrow view, and then had an even worse one, the kind of the indispensable names and events, then ended up with a really interesting document, which was a critical view allowed for an awful lot of actually debate about what had made Britain at the end. And then I think, having done that, he then left that job. That's all of a prelude in which to say that if I was designing something which joined up the dots more, and Margaret obviously is incredibly right about story, it's astonishing to me that the Civil War isn't part of it, really, that there's a huge jump post-Tudor. And the Civil War, families are divided, religions are divided. Hello, 21st century.
Yeah.
It's extraordinarily powerful piece of storytelling. The king loses his head, another one. It has absolutely everything. I'm not proposing that should be the kind of uber module, but that's an instance really where it's entirely possible to actually show quite young kids, really, how you might take one position and take another. And just when you think Charles I is deserving everything, he gets, you can, a kid can make his case at his trial that Parliament had no jurisdiction with great coherence and authority. And you can do that, and kind of wherever you look, I think actually, there's so many historical ways in which that could happen.
Great.
Yeah, I maybe have a slightly different take on, well, no, I don't think it is a different take. I mean, because I work on the history of China, which isn't generally part of the furniture of people's education in this country. They might, and I'm afraid I'm not familiar with the kind of curriculum today, but people might have heard of the Opium Wars, or they might have heard of the Cultural Revolution if they're doing the Cold War or whatever. But the sort of, does the Tang dynasty come before or after the Song? How many people feel really kind of confident? How many people? Okay, that's a kind of which comes first? William the Conqueror or Queen Elizabeth kind of question, right? Now, in a way, my education in studying China at university from kind of quite a young and probably overly impressionable age was very much in a model of you either knew everything or you knew nothing. It was a kind of classic Orientalist model, that you were either a specialist on China or you didn't know anything. So there was everything, it was a kind of zero-sum game. You knew everything or you knew nothing. And I've been very committed to the value of knowing a little bit. You know, I think it's valuable to know a few things. You know, so you would have to spend a long time to know all about all of the history of China, but you wouldn't have to spend very long to know a few things. Similarly, you wouldn't have, you know, the history of Russia or the history of Canada. These tend to be things that it's felt you either need to know everything about them or you know nothing. And I mean, that's not a helpful kind of answer. How you do that? I mean, it's more my sense of, my own experience, and admittedly this is an experience of teaching undergraduates, is that it is possible for people to do, it's possible for, if you can get people interested, it's possible for them to do very good work in a very short time by knowing a bit. You know, they don't have to know everything.
I mean, I think once you learn how to learn, then you can learn more. And I think, I mean, one of the things I think is also important is to show the interconnectedness of histories. I mean, too often I think we're still caught in the nationalist versions of history. And, you know, my own view is you can't really understand British history without understanding Britain's relationship both to the empire and to Europe. I mean, it is part of both. And to treat it as a separate history seems to me to be absolutely wrong. To treat the country, my own country, Canada, as a separate history when we live next door to the biggest power in the world, you know, we're not going to notice it. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. So I do think, you know, I think I think I agree with both of you. I have a gentleman here, and someone. I'm going to take three. Is that if I'm up? It's like betting. Okay, so three this time. 1, 2, and then someone up there at the back. Okay, 1. Yep. There's a microphone if you want. Oh, good. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Don't you think our problem is that, I mean, as a student of history, that history as a subject is very Eurocentric? And it's not just history, but overall humanities, philosophy, even sciences. We all begin with Greeks. I mean, you did that on Monday, again today. And everything begins with the Greek, then the Romans made it more sophisticated, then we come to Victorians until we reach Boris Johnson. So, so my feeling is that there is a bias, and it's a Europeanization of history. I'm not being, you know, a demolition man. What I'm saying is that the world history, I mean, still we are dealing with Macaulay and Mill, you know, the way they define Indian history, for example, or how Bernard Lewis defines Muslim history, or the Arab history today. So I think the problem is that we have confined world history to Europe, and the rest of them stay, quote-unquote, barbarians. So unless, I think, preeminent historians like you use all the channels and make it into world history, and not make European history into an exceptional kind of history, different from the rest of the world, or the rest of the world has to match up to this history, I think we will be dealing with this kind of problem, unevenness. And that's why you get the responses like nationalist history. Nothing wrong with national history. It's the nationalist history which is problematic.
So your question is, you're asking us to agree with you? Yeah? Okay. But yeah. Okay, I think there's a lady just here. If you could just pass it back this way, actually. Thanks. Thank you.
Given the ongoing debates and discussions about the Rhodes Must Fall movement and the statue of Cecil Rhodes and the wider conversations about British colonial legacy that are going on at the student level and in the national media, do you think there's a time and a place for public reconsideration of national histories, of people we used to celebrate? Do you think that's ahistorical, or do you think it's important morally?
Okay, thank you. And then that, you'll have to shout, I'm afraid. Yeah, go ahead.
Dr. MacMillan, we've been talking about the teaching of history and historians engaging with popular perceptions. But Dr. Schama, can you hear me?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Dr. Schama, you mentioned the engaged historian and a certain type of engagement in politics and contemporary events, which can also become part of the package. And Edward Thompson did a brilliant job of becoming probably one of the most engaged historians of his generation. In his work against the bomb and whatnot. And yet, I was chatting with him about him with Eric Hobsbawm before he died. And Hobsbawm felt that a lot of E.P. Thompson's better historical research. And Tony Judd has about him in his excellent essay in the book Reappraisals. And I think that part of the problem historians also have is being very engaged with their age. And would you like to comment on this?
Okay, I don't know if you could all hear the voice from the heavens. It wasn't George Weidenfeld, but would we like to comment on I think perhaps a suggestion was that if historians get too engaged, they perhaps become less good historians. So, Simon and then Craig.
Well, no, I'll take the last question, because my answer to the two of you is basically yes and yes. So I can do that easily. And here I can do a bit of egregious, trailerizing. I'm part of the project which James kindly mentioned, is hubristically titled Civilizations, and it's precisely revisiting some of the spirit of Kenneth Clarke's history of art, but doing world art, taking world art not only seriously. It's the connectedness actually between non-European and Western art. So we're doing our best. The point you made, I don't know. It's funny Eric should say that. He wasn't exactly not engagé in his own works. He was often caught out by history, I think. But it's sort of it's so mistakenly headmasterly to think you have a kind of quota of research to fulfill, and if you're not doing it, then somehow the world is a poorer place. As you exactly said, Edward Thompson was an extraordinary, romantic, charismatic, rhetorical figure. And there's no question that his great history of the rise of the working class and its enemies owed something to the sense that he felt he was a socialist citizen of the world, and vice versa. And the passions flowed both ways, with no harm to either, in my view.
Well, I suppose I'm a yes and a yes as well. I mean, obviously, I'm not going to, centricity. I mean, yes. I mean, I think the history that people are taught in this country is far too Eurocentric. But that's just all there is about it. But then it's quite possible that I think the history that's taught in Chinese schools is too Sinocentric, and in all of those, everywhere in the world, on the primary school classroom, there is a map of the world which has us at the middle of it, isn't there? The one that was on my classroom wall as a child had Europe in the center of the world, and Asia's over there, and America's over there, and the Americas, and in China, the maps on the classroom wall have China at the middle, and America over there, and Europe over there. So that's again a kind of, I mean, there are two levels. I think tactically, yes, I'm doing my best to make the curriculum less Eurocentric by teaching students about the art of China and getting them to think seriously about it and getting them to engage with it, not as a, and sort of, it's almost about how you present things to people. Yeah. I mean, if you say to people, this is completely different and you'll have to have your brain rewired in order to understand this, you're going to get one kind of response. But if you just say kind of, okay, let's get stuck in, it's amazing what people will take.
Yeah. I'm still with this lady, and my new friend, the teacher, and we have, in the United States, in middle school, junior high, and at high school, there is world history. You get 1 year. There are more hours a week, actually, you get in history than you do in this country, rather extraordinarily. Yeah. And immediately the problem arises, doesn't it, actually? How much can you do in a couple of hours a week? And given that you always seem to start, really, with the Aztecs, who never go away, actually. And so the issue, it's an extreme case of what you said earlier, Craig, with which I heartily agree about. A bit actually doesn't do you any harm at all, but the test of which bits you're going to do when you're not being Eurocentric, I'd love to hear what it become a huge pedagogical problem, actually.
And there is something to be said, I think, for knowing about your own neighborhood. I mean, if you're going to live in a society, I think to understand how that society got to be where it was, I still would say you don't need to do this thinking in terms of national boundaries, but to understand the institutions with which you're, in the midst of which you're living, to understand capitalism, to understand the nature of a particular kind of government. It does help to know something of the history of it.
There is, and sometimes with that in mind, and with both of your issues in mind, it is very weird, however, that the question isn't put to school children, really. How the hell did I get to Bradford? You know what I mean? By which I mean, why not do the point exactly at which British history and Indian history came together, tragically, or you know, however you want to. Providing it isn't just simply an anti-colonialist rant, providing it does actually recover the full richness of both greed, power, and occasionally good intentions as well. So why wouldn't you do British Indian history, and that, you know, which has much to explain about why British Asian population where it is, and we can think about other instances too.
Yeah, and I think just on the Roads Must Fall, the statue thing, which has been exercising people a lot in Oxford, it's not easy. I tend to think that in 1945 I would have wanted to take statues of Hitler down, because it was immediate, he was dreadful, the whole thing was awful. 100 years later, what purpose is served by taking the statue down? I think we need to ask, might it be better? I mean, this would be my view, but you can certainly disagree with it. Might it be better to leave it up and discuss it, use it as a way of educating people about the history? And the statue doesn't have to be there because we all think that person is wonderful. I mean, there's a statue of Oliver Cromwell in Parliament Square. You can have many different opinions of him, which I think is as it should be. And I would prefer to leave the statues and the names on the street. I mean, in Canada we have lots of streets named after governors general who came out from England. Most people don't know who they were, but it's a bit of our history. It's a way of remembering that at one point we were part of the British Empire. I think we have time, James, for 3 more questions? Or okay, so 3 more questions. Okay, someone at the very back. Yes, gentleman in the check shirt. And then the lady down here. And have I got one more hand somewhere?
There's a lot of people upstairs.
Okay, oh, sorry. Okay, the lady leaning over the balcony. Don't lean too far, please. Okay, so check shirt. Who was the other one? I said someone else over there. And then the heroic lady in the balcony. Okay.
So my question's about how historians should engage in public history and what are the practices they should use. Because you said something about, do historians keep their historian's hat on and engage as experts? In which case the dialogue has this problem that I think it becomes excessively pedagogical. It's almost as if the historian tells the public, this is the history that existed, or almost as such. Because I'm thinking about in India, the problems that have come up around from the 1990s onwards, really, about mosques and temples, and how history can't really adjudicate on the birth of gods, effectively. And that there have been big problems because people don't want to listen, in some sense, because it seems that historians are saying, you're wrong, you're superstitious, you're this, whatever. And there might be a problem in that. Do we engage with historians' hat on, or do we join the public in a debate, in a dialogue over what's going on?
Okay, thank you. And I think we had a question. I pointed at someone down here. Where was it? This lady right here in the front. While we're getting the microphone, I'll ask our friend in the balcony if she would like to shout down to us.
I was just wondering, particularly with regards to the history of Chinese art and in a global history, how you would combat this very simplistic narrative of East meets West.
Yeah.
That kind of lazy go-to.
Good, thank you. I don't know if you all heard the question, but if we're going to encourage people to look at Chinese art, how do we get away from that old narrative of East meets West, or West meets East? Here's the West, we all sort of understand it, there's the exotic East. I mean, I'm slightly adding to you, but I think, is that the sense? And then if we could have the lady right at the front here, thank you. It's on.
I'm probably rather going back to the teaching bit, but I do wonder whether people actually know what is really being taught in history in schools, because a lot of what you are saying, and I've read in the press about what we should be doing, I seem to have been doing for the last 30 years. So I do wonder whether actually there's perhaps more of it than you realise, and whether anybody else would agree with that. I don't know.
Are you a teacher?
I am, yes.
Yeah, well, thank you. This is very reassuring.
Have you been teaching the Civil War?
Yeah.
Wow. Well, I did go around schools when I was actually, and that was really
and British India, and the Empire, and all this sort of stuff. But
where
maybe
do you teach?
In the Cotswolds.
What kind of school?
Comprehensive. Well, no, they're not called that, are they, anymore?
Yeah.
Well, you're a hero. Honestly,
Yes.
I did go
Yeah,
to schools, lots of them, all
Yeah.
over the country, and that was not
But
the
that's
case.
School's History Project.
Pardon?
School's History Project.
How many hours a week do you teach? History?
Not quite 2.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I think we've got
Anyway.
3, thank you, very good questions here. So, Craig, I'm going to ask you to start, and then...
Well, can I start with
Yeah.
kind of East and West, which you know is obviously has been the kind of structure that's been you know that a lot of this has been cast into. Well, I think the ways one kind of attempts to overcome it are first of all by acknowledging that this is how it's been, you know, that this is how it's been done. That you have to kind of try and make people a bit conscious of. You know, I think audiences can take sometimes quite complex ideas, and that a little bit of, I mean, not too much, but a little bit of kind of meta-history or historiography, or, you know, how did we come to think about it in this way, is not a bad thing. Now, I mean, I suppose I'm thinking this is different in terms of, in the context of the Ming exhibition, the very powerful presence of material objects can do things that kind of mix up people's sort of preconceptions about things. You know, the Quran that was written in Beijing, you know, that immediately makes people, hang on a minute, I thought, you know, that was there and that was there. So that you can start, I think the power of museums and material culture to kind of complicate some of those simplistic narratives. And I think, I would say this, wouldn't I, but I do think art history has a kind of particular role to play there, because it's often about images and objects and things that kind of move around the world. I mean, the kind of classic example in the recent age would be the Neil MacGregor 100 Objects, you know, which was very good at kind of at complicating those narratives. I mean, I don't think it's terrifically easy, but I think if you start by acknowledging that there is this problem, and why is it that we think about this? I mean, what I do, the very first lecture that I give first-year undergraduates, I give them a map of the world with no lines on it except the continents. I give them a map of the world, and I ask them to draw a line around the West. Not the East, because if I ask them to draw a line around the East, people kind of in this country sort of think they know where the East is, but if you ask people to draw a line around the West, immediately that throws up, well, is Australia in the West? You know, so you're putting that, you know, at the beginning of the first lecture for first-year undergraduates. You're saying, look, we need to talk about these things. We need to think about them.
Lovely. Simon, do you want to do anything?
No, I think your question is very tough, particularly and a very good one. I have to say thank you everybody, actually, in any case, because the questions have been annoyingly fabulous, you know, really. And yours is very tough, you know, when you said, well, it's all very well to really try and bring, you know, communities into connection with each other through history. That's really what you want, and most of us, I hazard to say, possibly all of us, want from history. And yet people, they're just, you know, they tune out something which doesn't actually ring the bells of their own initial, you know, the dreaded identity politics or identity politics of faith. You just have to fight that fight somehow with whatever means, with the web, with books, with whatever means, whatever arrows we have in our quiver. And I'll just say this at the risk of, again, sounding horribly sententious, is that for me, at any rate, history has always been about alterity. It's always been about why I loved it, why I still love it, is that it's about discovering people who are not like you, who are separated from you in time, for a start. A bit like you, as I said, the Butterfieldian thing. But essentially are separated from you in time and geographical space, and it's an imperfect encounter between you and your subject matter, really. And if you can somehow wrap that up into a kind of punching fist of erudite literature, however you then, you know, deliver the knockout, in whichever medium, you won't entirely have lived in vain as an historian.
I think the great thing, and you've both shown it, is that history should be fun. It's interesting, it's fascinating, there's always something new to find out, there's always a new part of the world to find out, there's always a new period in history to find out something about. And I do agree so much with Simon and Craig that what it does is it can and should expand our imaginations to think of other worlds in which people held values that were not ours, that did things in ways that were not ours, is very good for us. And I think, if anything, I mean, it should be fun, it should be entertaining, and maybe teach us a little bit of humility, that we are not the cleverest and the most advanced peoples in the world, that there were lots of other people in the past who may have done things differently, but who did things well, and I think that's important to remember as well. So I think I'd like to thank you all both very much indeed, and thank you. Very good questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to them all, and I apologize for everyone whose arms I missed, but I think it's a tribute to both of you that you provoked so many questions that we couldn't have answered them all. So thank you both very much.